put them in the chat. And we are now right half of the hour to go to the second talk. The second presenter is Brendan Clark, and Brendan is a PhD candidate at Rutgers Universities, working with Ellen Robock and studying the impacts of crops on climate change and stratospheric aerosol climate intervention scenarios. And yeah, please go ahead and share your talk, which is on the optimal climate intervention scenario for crop production. Yeah, that varies by nation. Thank you. And we see your presentation. You need to put it into slide mode. Yep, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks, Simone, for the introduction and for inviting me to give this talk. So today, like Simone said, I'm going to be presenting on a recent paper that I've been working on, along with my co-authors listed here, the title of which is The Optimal Climate Intervention Scenario for Crop Production Varies by Nation. So just a quick outline of what I'll talk about. I'll go through and introduce the problem. I'll talk about agriculture impacts from SAI from previous studies. I'll discuss how different SAI scenarios impact national level crop production. And I'll talk about how using different crop models impacts the results that I'm showing. And I'll go through some concluding points and future work. All right, so on average, each day, every person on Earth consumes about 2,900 calories from food. And the majority of that comes from just 4 crops, which are corn, rice, wheat, and soybeans. So you can see the breakdown over here. You have rice, wheat, corn, and if you included soybean, it would maybe be about 50%. So understanding how the production of these 4 crops will change in the future is really important to understanding the world's ability to feed the planet. And so already today, almost 1 billion people in the world are going hungry, while countries like the US waste about 1/3 of the food that we produce. And so the map on the right here is showing the percent of a population in a country that's undernourished. And so already today, food production is unevenly distributed, and it's already a problem. And in the future, it's anticipated that the population will continue to increase, and along with that, so will food demand. And so in order to meet this growing food demand, the yields of maize, rice, wheat, and soybean all need to increase by about 60% by 2050. And so far, they're falling short of those targets. And climate change is something that's anticipated to make this problem worse. So this is a figure from a paper by Jonas Jägermeier, looking at the end of century changes to production under a high emission scenario, so SSP 585, and then in yellow, and then in green, this is a low emission scenario. And so this is results from the global gridded crop model intercomparison. So there's 12 different crop models that simulated these scenarios. And so you can see the black bar is the mean change. So for maize, it's a decrease of about a little over 20%. The mean change for wheat is an increase due to CO2 fertilization and things like expansion of cropping area to higher latitudes under climate change. And the mean change for soybean and rice is about 0. But remember, all of these values need to be going up to meet a growing food demand. And also, it's important to note there's a huge amount of uncertainty in this. So you can see the range for the different crop models. If you look at soybean, it's like plus or minus 40%. So the impacts to crop production under climate change have a huge amount of uncertainty. And that's, you can assume that that'll be the same for SAI too. So that leads me to what I'll be talking about. So these are all of the different potential methods to intervene on the Earth's radiative budget in order to counteract anthropogenic climate change. But the one that I'm going to be discussing today is this one, SAI, increasing the amount of stratospheric aerosols. So this is all of the studies that have been done in the past looking at agriculture impacts from SAI. So there's 5 of them here. So quickly, I'll go through them. Pongratz et al. Used a statistical model. The scenario was offsetting 2 times CO2 with solar reduction, and they found an increase to maize, rice, soybean, and wheat yields. Proctor et al. Used a statistical model. It was following this medium emission scenario, RCP 4.5, and it was using SAI to offset all warming, and it found that SAI would attenuate little of the global agriculture damage from climate change, so a small impact. Shaw et al. Focused on China using the DSAT crop model. The scenario was solar constant reduction to offset a 1% per year increase in CO2, and that study found a small impact on Chinese rice and an increase to maize. Zahn et al. Also looked at China using a rice model. The scenario was 5 teragrams of SO2 per year under this medium emission scenario again, and they found that rice yield would increase. And then the most recent study was Fawn et al. It used CLM5 crop with SEI to bring the net radiative forcing from a high emission scenario to a medium emission scenario. And they found that maize, rice, soybean, and wheat yield would increase by about 10%. So one of the unanswered questions from all of this that I've been focusing on is this idea that, first of all, you have to decide as a world whether or not to do SAI, which is a tough thing to decide. But then after that, say the world comes together and says, we want to do SAI. The next question would be, well, how much would you want to do? So which temperature target would you pick for your SAI implementation? So would the world want to maintain 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial? But why not 1 degree or 2 degrees above pre-industrial, or even return to pre-industrial global temperatures? And so understanding how different impact metrics like crop production are affected by various levels of SEI is important to informing future decision-making. And so just like how the IPCC assesses varying severities of future climate change with the SSP and the RCP scenarios, so too should varying levels of possible future SAI implementation. So the community Earth system model has run a bunch of scenarios, a bunch of SAI scenarios, and it's coupled to the community land model, which has an interactive crop model included, so we can look at direct output from these scenarios and how crops are impacted. So on the top left here, this is showing the GeoMIP G6 sulfur, which is using SO2 injection, and G6 solar, which uses solar constant reduction to bring net radiative forcing from the high emission scenario SSP 585 down to SSP2 4.5. The top right are these scenarios run by Simone. They follow, again, this high emission scenario, SSP 585, and also this overshooting scenario, SSP 534. This scenario basically follows SSP 585 until 2040, and then strong mitigation efforts are implemented, including things like carbon dioxide removal, so you get this quickly decreasing temperatures, but both of these still overshoot these temperature targets of 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial. So SAI is used to maintain those temperatures. And then finally, on the bottom right, we have scenarios that follow SSP2 4.5, this medium emission scenario. And so SAI is used to maintain 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. So this is called the ARISE scenario, if anyone's heard of that before. There are also scenarios that use SAI to maintain 1 degree above pre-industrial and also 0.5 degree above pre-industrial. And so you can combine all of these scenarios. And first, I'm showing the change to global calories under all these SAI scenarios relative to their climate change scenario. So the top panel is showing total production from all 4 of these crops combined, and then the individual crops themselves. And so you can see that in this crop model, SAI is benefiting all of these crops pretty much in every SAI scenario. And then the largest increases to calories is from this scenario, SSP 585 to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So it's pumping a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere and then lots of SAI to offset the warming. And this is kind of what you might expect with crops with CO2 fertilization and then offsetting the warming. That's what they tend to like. But for this scenario, depending on what you're looking at, so if you care about the ocean and fisheries, this might be like the worst scenario because you have a lot of CO2 that SAI isn't doing anything about, so you get ocean acidification. So it depends on what you're looking at and what you're interested in. So now if we go ahead and instead of looking at the global change, just looking at individual nations, which of these scenarios produces the highest calories from total production, all 4 crops, and then the crops individually. So you have in blue, it's just climate change, SSP2 4.5, and then in orange, going to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial, in green, 1 degree, and then this sort of maroon in 0.5 degree above pre-industrial. And so looking quickly, you can see, well, most nations tend to prefer this large level of SAI going all the way down to 0.5 degree above pre-industrial, but certainly not all of them would prefer that scenario. So there's plenty of countries that would prefer 1 degree or 1.5 degrees, or even no SAI at all. So they prefer climate change. And so this is sort of introduces sort of a concern in terms of policy. First of all, deciding whether or not to do any SAI, because plenty would prefer climate change. But then if you do decide to do it, what temperature target would you pick? So like what temperature would you set the global thermostat at? Could potentially be a source of conflict. And so this is showing the same thing, but with a different scenario, and it's sort of the same story. most nations tend to prefer this the most SEI, so 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial in this scenario. But there are still some that would prefer 2 degrees or just climate change without any SEI at all. And so one thing you could say from those two plots that I just showed is that, well, a lot of those nations probably don't produce a lot of crops, which is probably true. So now I'm just looking at the top 10 producers of each crop: maize, rice, soybean, and wheat, showing the percent change to production for those crops. And so again, looking just quickly, you can see it's mostly increases to crop production in this crop model. But again, different nations will have the most benefit under different levels of SAI. And then there's also countries that would, for no SEI, would have a decrease to production under SEI. So things like Canadian maize, rice in the Philippines, Russian soybean, and Russian wheat. A lot of those scenarios are showing a decrease to production under SEI. So it's still sort of the same story. And even though most of the top producing nations show an increase to their production, I think it's still worth noting that there will still be a lot of nations that will decrease their production with SEI. So this is showing the number of countries that have a decrease to their production for the different crops under these SAI scenarios. And so it's anywhere from maybe like 15 nations with a decrease with soybean, all the way up to 70 nations decreasing their production of rice under SAI. And so even though these countries may not be producing a lot of crops, the crop production that they do produce is probably pretty important to them at a local scale. So it's still something to keep in mind. Okay, and here I'm just breaking down the impacts from SAI due to individual climate changes. So how does just changing temperature or just precipitation, humidity, diffuse radiation, and total radiation impact global production? And so you can see that the changes due to temperature have the largest impact on the total change in this crop model. This is probably going to be very dependent on the crop model that you use. And so one thing I've been saying this whole time is that these results are going to depend a lot on which crop model you use. Like the figure I showed before, showing impacts due to climate change with the different crop models, there is a huge amount of uncertainty. So this is just one crop model. So some future unanswered questions that we want to look at is what happens if you use other crop models forced by the same atmospheric data. So some preliminary results from this. So the ARISE simulations, SAI to cool to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial, and SSP 245 climate change scenario. Those scenarios saved the atmospheric data that we need to run other crop models besides just CLM crop. So Sam Rabin, who was a postdoc in our group, ran these scenarios with the LPJ gas crop model. And so you can see the difference in these solid lines. This is the difference between SAI and climate change for the different crops. And you can see that there's very, very small differences between those two scenarios. So almost no change, which is a much different answer than what we got with CLM. So if we look at the same plot with CLM, now climate change is in blue, or SAI is in red, there's pretty substantial increases to global yield under SAI. So just using two different crop models, we get two very different answers. And so it would be very good to use other crop models in the future. So we're planning so far to use CLM5 crop, LPJ gas, and then the PDSAT crop model. And hopefully other crop models that would be willing to participate in this too would be great. And we also have output from other climate models that ran these scenarios. So we have CESM2, and then also the UK ESM climate model ran these scenarios too and saved the output that we need. So we can compare uncertainty in the climate response of SEI for different crop models. So just in conclusion, different nations would prefer different amounts of SEI to maximize their crop production. And some may prefer no SAI at all. And so how would the world decide on just one temperature target to pick? And so this is just crop production. You could look at other impact metrics, like I mentioned, the ocean or fisheries, and that would probably make the answer even more complicated. And also preliminary analysis shows there's a large amount of uncertainty to how crops would be impacted by SAI depending on the crop model that you use. So some future work is to run harmonized SAI scenarios with more crop models, hopefully at least 3, maybe more. Also, our group is working to update the crop models to include impacts from surface ozone and UV radiation, which are both anticipated to change from SAI. And those impacts haven't really been quantified in a modeling setup like this before. And then another thing I'm working on is seeing if SAI can be designed to specifically control for crop production metrics. So all of the scenarios I've been showing so far use a feedback control algorithm to control for global temperature metrics. So seeing if you can use that algorithm to instead control for crop production metrics is something that I'll be looking into. But yeah, that's pretty much all that I have. So I can take questions from anybody if there are any. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Great talk. Very interesting. Yeah, please raise your hand if you have questions or put some in the chat. And I see already one by Mike McCracken. You want to unmute yourself?
Hi, it's very interesting. How do you account for, or do you account for how farmers might respond to the kind of impacts by changing strain of seeds or changing what they fertilize, or is that kind of adjustment allowed for?
So that is something we're working on in a bit. So things like fertilization are just prescribed based on the different climate change scenarios. So that's not really super transient and doesn't really change that much with SAI. But things like when you choose to plant your crops and when you choose to harvest them is an update on the model that Sam Rabin has been working on. So having an interactive crop calendar that shifts based on the changing climate is something that hopefully we'll be able to assess pretty soon. But yeah, other things like nitrogen and irrigation application are just things that are prescribed. So they wouldn't be different between SAI and climate change in this model.
And is there a sort of a market effect too? I mean, farmers also change what they do in response to the markets and relative prices or something like that.
Yeah, there's certainly would be an impact from that too. And you could try to assess that with something like an integrated assessment model or something, but yeah, a climate model wouldn't really be fit to answering that. But certainly, yeah, there would be impacts from that too.
Thanks.
Thanks. Next is Hong Wai.
Thank you, very nice talk. So I have a question. I may have missed how do you calculate the production? Is that a net production including like both process of photosynthesis and respiration, or like just focusing on the photosynthesis?
Yeah, so it's the way that production is calculated in these global gridded crop models is usually with something called growing degree days. So it's basically a metric of accumulated days of growing when some temperature threshold is met. So you meet some temperature threshold and you plant the crop, and then yeah, you basically calculate photosynthesis, how much carbon is stored in the crop, and then there's leaf emergence after a certain amount of days has been met, and then a grain fill stage, and then finally you harvest. But it's predominantly based on temperature, yeah, and photosynthesis.
Okay, so do you think like there may be some like loss rate from the respiration?
Yeah, there is. That's calculated too.
Oh, that's calculated. So is it also possible to separate the influence from these two processes to see how those two processes influence the production?
Yeah, you could probably, you mean like go into the model and turn off respiration?
Yeah, because like you get a production from like the SI's influence. Is that possible? We can separate this total influence to two parts. One is from the SI influence the photosynthesis, another is SI influence respiration. I'm just curious.
Yeah, you probably hypothetically could do that. You'd probably have to go into the model and change the code and have respiration like turned off from one of the runs and then compare it to with respiration and see how different it is, I guess, if you wanted to answer that question. But you could, yeah, you could do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Ellen, do you have an addition to that?
Yeah, Brendan, great talk. And I wanted to respond to Mike. It's complicated. You're right. Farmers make decisions based on the market, based on should I change the type of seeds I plant? What is there going to be an El Nino this year? What are the forecasts, seasonal forecasts, if they have any skill in your place? And so it's very complicated, and we're trying to change one thing at a time just to do the simplest things first. CO2 is going up too. That has a big effect. So that's why we're using the same SSPs that don't change that and specify those things. But once you include human behavior and market forces and economics, it gets very complicated. But we'll get there, but we want to know, can you actually feed the whole world? Will everybody have enough food, not just with a global average temperature of food production change? And can you design a system where the feedback to the amount of spraying would be based on food production, not polar equator temperature gradient, which nobody really cares about. They care about how much food they have. And so we're getting there, but it's complicated. We're doing it one step at a time. And by the way, Lily's going to talk next, but you should, Brendan's working with me and Lily, not just me.
Yeah. Lily, do you want to go next? Thank you, Ellen.
I just want to add some response to Hong Wen. I don't think really you can, like, the model output will include photosynthesis and the respiration, the plant respiration and soil respiration. So you can look into those output and trying to figure out how those different processes are changing under climate intervention. But I don't think you can turn off respiration and really study how photosynthesis only impact plant growth. So I think those are all connected, but you probably can add some output to specify the carbon intake from photosynthesis and the carbon emission from respiration, and then to do further analysis. But I doubt you can turn off respiration. That's all.
Okay, thanks. I do have also a question or more a comment, and we had discussed that earlier. When you do show your changes, they are all with regard to the future baseline scenario, whatever that is, right? The scenario is either a rise 4.5 future warming, 8.5 warming. So what you're showing is the differences compared to that. That means if you say there are reductions in crops, that's already because you're assuming that climate change in the future has done something and then the crops are reduced. But I think it is also very important to make sure to compare to present day, because I think if one country with climate change gets a lot of crop increase, but then due to SAI gets half of the crop decrease again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that it will mitigate some of the increase of the crops. And I just wanted to see what you think about that or make that comment.
Yeah, that's right. I have a figure that I made that's in the paper that shows this. But yeah, when you compare it to some historical period or a period that's not future climate change, then if you compare SAI to that, then it's pretty much all increases because of CO2 fertilization. So CO2 is going up in the future, which is going to benefit pretty much all of the crops, regardless of climate changes. So yeah, if you compare it to some historical period, it's pretty much SAI or climate change. It's pretty much all increases because of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's also important when you think about the optimal temperature in a way, because some people may win more than others, but if all winning, right, then that's a different way of looking at it, maybe, than saying you have losers and winners.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Just the thought. Thanks. Okay, are there any? There's one more. Hey, Rob, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think that was the last comment there, point you made there was what I was going to ask about, which was one could, if you write, you said this is in you've submitted it. It looks like, I mean, that basically there's mostly winners under SAI, or rather, maybe if we accept we're going to have a higher level of carbon in the atmosphere because it takes forever to get rid of it, then you basically need SAI to keep the crops yields increasing. So is that kind of the storyline? Or, I mean, I know I'm kind of being provocative here, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think you could, there's a lot of ways that you could probably frame it. But I've been thinking about it as, you're going to have climate change. So that's sort of your new normal. And then if you decide to do SAI on top of that, relative to what it would have been, certainly lots of places are going to decrease their production relative to that. But if you just look at it as relative to like some historical period, like Simone said, then yeah, that's pretty much all winners. But it sort of depends on how you look at it, I guess. But I make that clear in the paper, yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
And there is a comment by Andrew.
Yeah, apologies if this has been covered. I just lost my connection during the Q&A. But is it not possible that farmers will select different cultivars or switch from one crop to another to optimize their production, and therefore there might not be the fall in production, or there might be a further optimization of production beyond what you'd expect. Most of the models I see that look at this don't really assume that farmers are going to do too much swapping and switching, but in reality, that's one of the key things that farmers do, is to plant at different times or plant different crops to optimize their yields, right?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this. So that's one thing that we're working on, and I think Sam has already implemented it in the crop model, is having interactive planting and harvesting dates that respond to a changing climate. But things like shifting cultivars is something that you probably could look at, but it's just, yeah, it's a complicated thing to a question to answer, like Alan said. So certainly shifting cultivars would have an impact too. And these models sort of assume one constant cultivar. So that's something that you could look at in the future if you were able to parameterize a different cultivar and see how that would change within the model too. That's sort of, those things are sort of future work, I would say. But yeah, they're definitely important too.
Thanks. Are there any more questions? Okay, so that was great discussion. Thanks everybody for joining. Just a quick announcement. We don't have a symposium in July because of lots of people on travel. We have the GeoMed meeting coming up and so on. So the next one will be in August, and we'll still have people that are on the list that will speak, but we would encourage everybody who wants to give a symposium talk, please contact us, and also nominate others that you think that would like to speak here. Okay, with that, thank you very much, everybody, and I hope you have a good weekend. Bye.